Good evening and welcome to the 2025 United Services Institute, the ACT Blamey Oration. The Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey Memorial Fund, in partnership with the Royal United Services Institute, Australia, hosts the annual Blamey Oration, a series of national events, including tonight, that honour Australia's only Field Marshal and his enduring legacy of leadership and service. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our honoured guest, Air Chief Marshal the Lord Peach, KG, GBE, KCB, DL, as our speaker for this year's oration. We'll start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and connections to land, water and community. We would also like to pay our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have contributed to the defence of Australia in times of peace and war. Let's get the evening started. Please welcome USI-ACT's President, Bill Henry.
Thanks, Tom. Distinguished guests, members of the USI-ACT, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Council of the USI-ACT, welcome to the 2025 Blamey Oration. I'm Air Vice Marshal Retired Bill Henman, President of the USI-ACT, and I would firstly like to welcome our official guests. So, belt up, there's a few. Air Chief Marshal Sir Angus Houston, AKAFC retired, former CDF and Lady Houston. Oh, my apologies, Lady Houston can't make it. Mr. Dennis Richardson, AC retired, former Ambassador to the US, former Secretary of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and former Secretary of Defence, among other things. Ms. Jennifer Coleman, Minister Counsel and National Security on behalf of the UK High Commissioner. Ms. Manon Dumas, Deputy High Commissioner on behalf of the Canadian High Commissioner, Her Excellency Dr. Julie Sunday. Mr. Matt Anderson, PSM, Director of the Australian War Memorial. Rear Admiral Matt Buckley on behalf of Chief of Navy, Rear Admiral Brett Sonta on behalf of Chief of Joint Operations and Becky. Dr. Paul Robards, Chief Data Integration and AI Officer, Department of Defence. Mr. David Nockels, First Assistant Secretary, Defence Trade, Regulation and Industrial Collaboration, and Diane. Air Vice Marshal Retired Neil Hart, AM and Ali. Air Vice Marshal Jason Begley, CSM, First Assistant Director General, Expeditionary and Transnational Intelligence, ASD. Air Vice Marshal John Haley, DSC, CSC, Head of Military Strategic Planning, and MICA. Air Commodore Scott Parry, Director General, Aerospace Surveillance and Response. And other notable attendees acknowledge the presence of Mr. Tom Rogers, AO, former Australian Electoral Commissioner. Air Marshal Retired John Harvey, AM. And a number of other distinguished guests, and we really should cut to the chase rather than acknowledge everybody here further. Thank you all of those distinguished guests here on invitation. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge the presence of our patron, Lieutenant General Peter Lay, AC, and Lee. It is now my great pleasure, on behalf of USI-ACT members and guests here, to welcome Air Chief Marshal the Lord Peach, KG, CBE, KCB, DL, as our Blamey Orator for 2025. Lord Peach is a Fellow of the Royal College of Defence Studies, an Honorary Fellow of the Downing College, Cambridge, and Royal Institute of Navigation. He was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen, KCB, in 2009, became a Knight Grand Cross of the British Empire, GBE, in 2016. Lord Peach was appointed by His Majesty the King as a Knight Companion of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, KG, in 2024. He became a crossbench peer in the House of Lords in November 2022. If you can believe it, there will be more about his most distinguished career achievements and current commitments, and will be presented later when Kendi Howe, my Deputy President, will formally introduce Lord Peach prior to inviting him to the podium. Welcome and thank you, Lord Peach, for agreeing to be our orator this evening. I seek your patience for a few minutes while I briefly present some background on who we are and why we're here tonight. The Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Strategic Studies Australia is an independent public research and education association which seeks to enhance understanding of defence and national security issues within Australia and internationally. Our purpose is to promote critical examination and encourage debate on important issues across both national and international defence and security issues. Each year in various forums, the USI ACT is privileged to invite eminent speakers from across Australia and from around the world to address the membership and guests. The Blamey Oration is our keynote event, which honours the memory and legacy of Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey, GBE, KCB, CMG, DSO, ED. Our previous orators have included distinguished serving and retired defence officers from both Australia and overseas, distinguished retired ambassadors and public services and servants and secretaries, principals and heads of Australia's security agencies. Tonight, Lord Peach will add to that distinguished list of orators with a presentation titled Stronger Together, Australia-UK Defence and Security Partnership in a Time of Peril for the World. And finally, a brief, important word on appreciation to acknowledge the support and effort that goes into making events like this possible. Significantly, events like tonight would not be possible without the sponsorship and support of our key partners, who, like USI ACT, contribute directly and indirectly to national resilience and are a key component of the interconnected fabric that supports and delivers defence capability to enable a safer and more secure Australia. They are the Department of Defence, our principal sponsor for Lord Peach's visit, represented here tonight by Dr. Melanie O'Byrne and Captain Alistair Walsh, RAN. Talis Australia, represented here tonight by Dr. Shelby Higgs and Mr. Sean Choi. Elysium EPL, represented here tonight by Mr. Anthony Allen and David Swan, and Synergy, represented by Mr. McMay and Emma Pilbeam. And also Microsoft, who are here in spirit. To all our sponsors, thank you for our ongoing support. To my council, all of our USI ACT Council members and associate support team are full-time employed with their own career commitments and part-time counsellors for the USI ACT. And without their voluntary contribution of their time and efforts, nights like this would not be possible. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the support we get from the Defence Department more broadly, not just for the generous provision of venues, but the time and support of the very busy heads of departments and ADF officers who attend our events and address our members throughout the year. We have a great evening ahead, so I'll get out of the way. Please enjoy the dining service and we'll get through the initial program before the oration. Thank you.
So ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, members of the Australian Defence, our allies, partners, good evening. We gather tonight beneath the walls of memory and service here at the Australian War Memorial, where the cost of strategy is not abstract and where the consequences of leadership are written in names, not footnotes. The Blamey Oration is not simply a lecture, it's a moment of national reflection. It is where history, power, sacrifice, responsibility briefly occupy the same space. And it is where we're reminded that strategy is not a theory, it's a moral act. Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey understood this deeply. He understood that command is not about certainty, it is about decision under uncertainty. That leadership is not about control, it is about the responsibility of consequences. And that allied nations, while forged, and alliances, while forged in shared interest, are ultimately sustained by shared resolve. Tonight's oration, Stronger Together, Australia-UK Defence and the Security Partnership in Time of Peril for the World, could not be more precisely timed, because the world is no longer drifting towards disorder. We are already there. We're living through the compression of eras, where industrial war meets digital war, where deterrence meets grey zone coercion, and where strategic competition is fought simultaneously in space, cyber, supply chains, capital flows, in data, ideology, and in narrative. I offer one of my favourite quotes. Leon Trotsky once warned, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. For much of the last generation, Western democracies believed quietly that war had become discretionary, that prosperity, integration, institutions had domesticated power. That illusion is over. The rules that governed the last 30 years of security are dissolving fast, faster than the institutions and our institutions can recalibrate. Strategic warning times are shrinking, decision cycles are accelerating, and the margin for error is narrowing. And yet, amid all of this volatility, one truth remains stubbornly constant, and that is, no nation that matters can secure itself alone. Not Australia, not the United Kingdom, not even the United States. Alliances are no longer a multiplier of strength, they are now the precondition of relevance. But this raises the uncomfortable questions that responsible leaders must confront. What does alliance mean when advantage is temporary and dependence is structural? How do we preserve strategic agency while embedded in deeply integrated systems of power? And how do democracies maintain deterrence when legitimacy, law, latency, and logistics are themselves contested domains? These are not academic questions. They are operational, industrial, political, and moral. And this is precisely why we're here tonight and why tonight matters. Because our speaker is not merely a commentator of these questions, he stood inside them. Air Chief Marshal, the Lord Peach, is a strategist in the fullest sense of the word, one who has commanded force, shaped policy at the highest level, and borne responsibility across alliance, national and multinational command. As the Chief of the Defence Staff of the United Kingdom, he led the British forces through one of the most complex strategic periods in modern history, marked by renewed great power competition, the recalibration of Europe's security architecture, and the return of war to the continent. As chairman of NATO's military committee, he stood at the strategic nerve centre of the alliance, where reassurance, deterrence, escalation management and cohesion collide every day. And as a member of the House of Lords, he now shapes the policy environment that determines how power is authorised, constrained and deployed. Lord Peach has commanded air power, he has managed nuclear deterrence, has confronted Russia's war in Ukraine, not as a distant observer, but as a central architect of Allied military posture. He understands intimately the tension between strategic ambition and political reality, between industrial capacity and military demand, between deterrence theory as a theory and deterrence as a lived risk. Tonight, we are not here to receive platitudes about partnerships. We're here to be challenged on its future, because the Australia-UK relationship now sits inside something larger than shared history. It sits inside AUKUS and the remaking of the industrial nuclear trust, the weaponisation of interdependence, it sits inside the contest for technological advantage that would define military power for the next half century. And lastly, it sits inside a global order where alignment is no longer binary, but conditional and shifting. The question is no longer whether Australia and the United Kingdom are close. The question is whether we are strategically configured for the world that is arriving rather than the one that we are nostalgically anchored to. And that is the provocation for this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, the Blamey Oration has always been about leadership in moments of consequence. Tonight, that tradition continues. It is my great honour, on behalf of the United Services Institute, to invite you to hear from one of the most consequential strategic leaders of our time. Please join me in warmly welcoming the 2025 Blamey Orator, Air Chief Marshal, the Lord Peach.
Well, distinguished guests, I feel very humbled by that introduction. But I first of all want to echo the respect given to the place where we are. And I mean the place in both the setting for tonight and also the content for tonight. First of all, I'd like, as a former chair of the Imperial War Museum and therefore a colleague of the Australia War Memorial, to pay a tribute to the spirit of volunteering, where young boys, mainly boys, left these shores to fight for freedom in 2 world wars and fought bravely and brilliantly. One of them, of course, was a young Thomas Blamey, who fought very bravely, and the records of his patrols at Gallipoli are very, very moving, and then, of course, became a great leader in the Second World War. the only Australian Field Marshal commanding an Australian army of 500,000 men. And I'm not suggesting we need to do that today, but that generation, particularly in my case, I would echo in Bomber Command, who came from all over Australia as volunteers to go to the other side of the world and fly bombers night after night after night to fight for freedom. And that freedom that we enjoy today is not free. It was a phrase I learned in NATO. It's a phrase I will never forget. And whether it's the end of the Cold War or whether it's the world we're in, freedom is not free. And actually that Field Marshal, General Blamey, Field Marshal Blamey, would recognise our fractured world, I would suggest. And he would recognise the return of great power rivalry, because he lived through it, and the consequences of it. He would also recognise the first suggestion I make tonight, that we need to deliver on our shared values and not see them as just something we can discard. When we're under threat, it's our shared values that we should be prepared to protect. And we are challenged by endless, and I do mean endless, 24/7 endless mis and disinformation from those who wish our way of life harm and our values harm. Therefore, I would contend that AUKUS is a strategic move by three allies, three great partners who have that heritage from those wars to deliver deterrence by design. And deterrence, I know this, is hard work. It's 24/7 and it is really demanding. And for it, you need great intelligence. And as a former Chief of Defence Intelligence in the UK, I would just pay tribute to the Australian intelligence services, then and now. And our relationship matters. And the Five Eyes relationship matters. And it does give us more than the sum of its parts. And intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance of this great country and continent is really important. Space can help, new technologies can help, but we also need forces to be ready to show where things are and to have sufficient presence. And for that, AUKUS Pillar 1 is ideal by the provision of nuclear submarines. And it may be unusual for a bomber navigator from the Royal Air Force to say this, but I was given command of the nuclear enterprise by the British Prime Minister. So I do know how important nuclear submarines are, and they can give you maritime dominance. I would go further and suggest that when the fullness of time, and we don't have much time, so let's get on with Pillar 2. And it has to be secret. It cannot be discussed in open sources. It's not going to be led by think tanks, with all due respect to USI. But we've got to get on with game changers that can challenge the world we're in. And many people focus on policy and geopolitical risks. Tonight, in the spirit of Field Marshal Blamey, I'd also like to talk a little bit about how economics is colliding with strategy, how infrastructure, and again I learned this in NATO the hard way, is strategic. And I don't mean just ports and airfields, but I also mean pipelines, cables, sustaining our way of life is more than just the facilities you see that are unloading ships. And then the final thing I'd like to touch on tonight is how important our skills base and our people and the easy way in which UK and Australia interacts. I think we should capture that and make that a theme of AUKUS as we learn how to work with each other, as we did in the past. Sir Angus reminded me tonight of just how much West Australia was reconfigured in World War II as a submarine base. So there's nothing new around the Henderson idea. The strategic relevance of your country, your geography, and your place in the world has never been more important. 2 weeks ago, our dear friends in Canada, and thank you very much to the Deputy High Commissioner from Canada for being here tonight, much appreciated. At the Halifax Security Forum, which I went to every year for 10 years, I think, came up with the idea of CRINC. Bear with me. CRINC stands for China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And a year ago, I would have probably not mentioned it. Because I wouldn't, with all my experience, I would not have predicted that North Korean soldiers would deploy inside Russia, never in Ukraine, but inside Russia fighting for the Russian army. A year ago, I wouldn't have said in a setting like this that the Iranians would build a factory inside Tatarstan, inside Russia, which is churning out those wicked drones that call the Shahed 2, which attack Ukraine every night, manned by, entirely operated by Iranian workers. This is not now secret, it is open source fact. So Iran and North Korea are all in. For them, it sort of suits them, it suits their narratives to an extent. For China and Russia, it helps them. So whether or not this is a new acronym, I don't necessarily think it is. But it shows common cause. And that common cause is against our values and our way of life. The other thing I perhaps bring from a European perspective is how much hybrid is a phrase, sounds soft. How much is going on? Let me just tell you, not a public fact, but this is not necessarily a public event. But it was interesting, when the 12th large weapons storage facility in Europe mysteriously exploded, NATO took an interest and decided to try and, working with our allies, get to the bottom of it. And they hadn't just exploded because of lightning strikes or faulty electrical supplies. It was deliberate sabotage. Some of that was professional, but not all of it. There's a recent court case in the UK involving, let's call them a bunch of Bulgarians. This is now a matter of public record. It's in the court records, who fancied being operatives for the Russian GRU. The Russians were happy to oblige, gave them some money, and told them roughly where some of the very sensitive work was being undertaken in the UK to support Ukraine, which again mysteriously caught fire. What used to be explosions can often be traced and become acts of sabotage, so now they've switched to arson. More importantly, and I know that some of your intelligence chiefs, one of your intelligence professionals has said this recently, Australia, I'm afraid, is not immune to this. The UK is not immune to this. And some excellent police work in the UK has retraced the whole story. And I won't go on and on about it, but it's striking. None of them were professionally trained. They were relatively easygoing criminals who were paid by the Russians to set fire to a factory. It had a significant effect on the things we were supplying to Ukraine, which Ukraine really needed. So there was a mastermind behind it. And so we need to think about the world we're in, and I'll come back to what we might do about it, in that sort of way. In your region, I can see, as a visitor and as a frequent visitor, a lot of coercion happening. I can see, and I personally have spoken about this in the House of Lords, to zero effect. I can see that the freedom of navigation, which we fought for in previous centuries, is being eroded and challenged. And I've already touched on the boundaries blurring and softening between crime. And of course, there isn't really such a concept as maritime crime, but there are plenty of ships that hide themselves whilst at sea. And we have many distinguished maritime leaders in the room. You know that. They set off as one ship, they end up somewhere else. There's another ship, they disguise themselves and are trying to, not to be topical, it includes tankers moving oil, which is maybe not the oil that needs to be moved legitimately. So we can see the threat, and we can see the way in which some of the powers in that CRINC group are reacting to anything we do. I think the regional trends, therefore, are quite clear to us. Where I would like to push the boundary in the way that the Field Marshal would have recognised is just to remind ourselves that in the UK before the Second World War, the majority of the intelligence analysis was undertaken about Germany, in this case, Germany's ability to wage a war economically. It was not about the day-by-day doings of the Nazi regime. It was much more about the strength in depth in the economy. The analyticals were all about whether it's fighter production or whether it was munitions production, steel production, and so on. And geoeconomics, I think, in recent years has been slightly neglected and is seen almost as separate from geopolitics. And I would argue that it's not separate. And in this region, it's really clearly not separate. We may be seeing the second shock from China now as Chinese manufacturing needs new markets. 300,000 workers in Indonesia have lost their jobs in the garment sector this year alone. All along the east coast of Africa, the Chinese trade flows have gone from the monthly to the yearly. In other words, in 1 month last year, they've now times 12. And they are, I'm not going to say dumping, because that's a specific meaning, but they are flooding the markets around your region and around Latin America and beyond. And they're now running a $1 trillion surplus. At the same time, to link geopolitical risk with geoeconomic reality, President Xi has shifted the historical analysis of World War II in the last 3 months. And it's very striking. And in the last weeks, it's even more striking that he's now talking in speech after speech after speech about the historical winners of World War II and the historical contributors of World War II being the Russians and the Chinese. And that's new and that's different. As much as anything I learned in NATO, it's not so much whether we believe that narrative, it's who believes that narrative. And many of the people in the regions, in your region and the adjoining regions, will believe that narrative. And therefore we have to be careful about that. And I'm sure in questions, I'll get a question about the recent US national security strategy. These documents matter, but they're not the be-all and end-all. And I was responsible for many of these documents in NATO, and I can absolutely guarantee that all the chiefs of defence I presented them to did not read them as their homework. So these documents matter, but what matters more, ladies and gentlemen, is what is actually happening. And I do think that historical narrative shift, standing in this beautiful place, this wonderful memorial, really is something we need to think about and pay attention to. Therefore, the second reason why AUKUS matters, because we are very much open economies and we're therefore perhaps slightly more vulnerable to this sort of behaviour. And one of the ways we can respond to that, and I'm coming to responses now, is by speeding up our defence procurement, by strengthening our supply chains together. And at the recent excellent Australia-British Chamber of Commerce event in London, that was the key emerging theme. And on the supply side, AAA is available. You are a AAA nation. We are mainly a AAA nation most of the time. And together we can do that. We don't need to do it all in government. We can do this with our friends in the banks. They want to do this. Some of their restrictions are melting with the geopolitical shifts. And we can do this together, particularly strengthening supply chains and moving into areas of raw material stockpiles and the like. And this is something else perhaps not envisaged in the original thinking on AUKUS, but now needs to be thought through as we see the restrictions placed by China on rare earths. And we know, many of us in the room know, many of the people in the white jackets know how many magnets you need to make a submarine, or indeed for some of the other advanced military equipment. And so we need access to these rare earths. And again, there's something else here about AUKUS where we could work together. I touched on strategic infrastructure earlier. I think it's now critical that we take this seriously. In 2018, when I first went into the NATO appointment, we ran our biggest exercise since 1985. There were a lot of people telling us not to. It was just too big, it was too expensive, and then we decided to run it at full scale because we thought it would achieve a real-world effect with the Russians, which it did. The Russians got very angry about it. It was called Trigen Juncture. That doesn't matter. What matters is we realise the importance of host nation support. We realise the importance of port capacity and understanding it and knowing that you could put 6 of these ships in at one time rather than looking at a book that is probably out of date. We understood more about the cables upon which our way of life depends, and the ability of certain nations who wish us harm to interfere with those cables is very real. This is very topical in the UK. As mysterious, I can even name some of them. Russian ships keep appearing in the North Sea exactly in the right spot, not for what's on the water, but for what's on the seabed. So it's wrong to think that this is some fantasy threat. This is very real. And with that comes the risks. And then you need to think about, not necessarily a role for AUKUS, but we need to think about how to work with industry and commercial operators. I have experience of this back in 2010 where we did the counter-piracy mission, where actually the key, and I'll be honest and transparent about this, the key enabler for that mission wasn't any navy, it was the insurance industry. It was the insurance industry who'd had enough of the cost of bearing the cost of piracy. And they helped us put together a mission. Much more sensitive, all I'll say is, keeping the grain flowing across the Black Sea in the last few years has been a lot harder than has yet been revealed. Because the ships that move the grain have to transit through mined waters. And the easy risk assumption in the boardroom is that's too risky. So you have to find another way of doing that through reassuring that you know exactly for that sailing at that time in those waters that the mines are not there, to give that reassurance through the industry and the re-industry to get them to a point of insurance. And we're going to be doing the same thing, I suspect, in the months to come on civil aviation in Ukraine. All these things seem distant to many of us in uniform, but they're all part of what we have to do to find the solutions for the world we're in, for which we need new structures. I've talked about it around finance. It isn't a government responsibility completely, but it could be nations coming together, create a charter, a bit like a development bank, to do the supply chain strengthening. And the Defence Security Resilience Bank, which I chair as a declaration, is one way of doing that. And we can do that at speed, and we can do that now. We can do other things now. I really am struck through the Chamber of Commerce and others, we can work with our university sectors on nuclear engineering. We can work with universities between our countries on schemes to develop advanced engineering and stick to it. And it's going to be a great career for engineers in the years to come. And we need more skills, we need more engineers. Field Marshal Blamey created the Australian National University. Well done, Field Marshal. And he had the wisdom at the end of the Second World War to do that. He also, throughout his long career, put great store in the soldiers' training. And we need to return to that. He also understood that his success in a world war was enabled by reservists. And again, and this is what we have to do in the House of Lords, I declare my interest. I'm the President of Reserves and Cadets in UK. And my word, we need our reserves more than ever. Strategic reserve, in echelon to the regulars. Volunteer reserve to give us the strength in depth. A auxiliary reserve to enable us to create specializations and work with industry, or embed with industry, or have sponsored reserves in industry. All of that is going to become part of AUKUS. We just can't quite see it yet. But when you look back at how we organised in your wonderful country and in the UK in World War I and World War II. That's exactly what we did. We didn't have a blueprint in 1914 or 1940. But by 1942-43, whether it was the Empire training scheme, a word of the day in those days, or whether it was the way in which we integrated our forces together in World War II, there's a lot that we can relearn, and they are all techniques that will work, particularly to both deliver AUKUS Pillar 1 and 2 and to develop our ways of protecting our global critical infrastructure. And so I am, as a non-engineer, but I'm now, in my grandfather years, I really encourage us all to think about how we nurture and encourage and nourish the next generation of engineers, because, my word, we need them. And that was the fun bit, because somebody asked me, don't be completely miserable. So, of course we have a realistic threat. We need to increase our readiness. And that is an interesting challenge. We lived that in NATO. At the time, the US Defense Secretary under the previous Trump administration was my dear friend, General, then Honourable Secretary Jim Mattis. And he used to talk all the time about a readiness culture. And he left his mark, his legacy on NATO in developing that readiness culture, and I worked with two SACEURs on that. And you can do it. You can shift a culture from a low readiness to high readiness, and then you can sustain it. Deterrence operations, and we do it in NATO, we do it with our quick reaction alert, we do it with our submarines, is 24/7. But that's what you need to understand what's happening to you. I've already said, and I really want to emphasise the point, in the spirit of Field Marshal Blamey and all that generation, the sharing of intelligence is needed and more essential than it's ever been. But above all, it's the people-to-people links that really will prevail in the years to come. And that's the weakness of autocracies. If you think about it just for a moment on your way home tonight, most of those North Korean soldiers didn't know where they were, and they didn't know what they were doing. They were just obedient because they were frightened. That's not what I'm talking about in our relationship. That's not what I'm talking about in AUKUS. And that gives us, along with our financial structures, our edge. So Field Marshal Blamey and his generation answered the call. And we still recognise, honour and respect that. But my message tonight is our mission now is to preserve and protect our way of life through our values. And without being miserable, the threats and the risks are real. But I'll close with a simple sentence, which Field Marshal Blamey, I hope, would have agreed with, which is, we did it before and we can do it again. We need to be ready for our duty. Thank you. And I think I'm
We do have a few questions.
facing the barrage. Or incoming for the gunners in the room. I'm afraid I won't know who everybody is. I apologise for that.
I studied the PWE and SOE in World War II, and those were last-minute decisions to institute a propaganda unit, in the British Fighting Force, PWE, and the Special Operations Executive to do bangs and, other things. And their research was largely economic. So I just want to say, that initial economic research of knowing what strengths, industrial strengths, production strengths, etc., is very, very valuable, because you can build a propaganda platform, and also you know what to target in the later stages of war. So I think your point about that tonight is very valuable.
Well, what I think Mr. Churchill said was set Europe ablaze.
That's right.
It didn't always go well in all sorts of ways. I've studied I was the special envoy for the Balkan region for 4 years, and it didn't always go well in that region, I can assure you, because you can't trust every militia group to tell you the truth all of the time. Hence my point about the importance of intelligence. But you're right, and the lessons from those days have not been lost on those who wish us harm either. And many of the techniques are being copied.
That's right.
That's the interesting thing.
That's what I thought of.
Yeah.
But, they've learned those lessons.
They've learned the lessons, and they also, because of my Balkan experience perhaps, and I don't think I've ever talked about this, you have to understand that these conflicts, even if in Australia they're part of the heritage and you do such a great job on Anzac Day, both here of course and in London and elsewhere in the world, and of course above all in Kanakale or Gallipoli, but in other countries they're still living conflicts that we have now put in a bookmark history. And that was my lived experience of the Balkans. It was yesterday. And I've traipsed around all sorts of recent battlefields, and they've not begun to think about reconciliation. One of the things that marks the UK and Australia relationship with Germany is the reconciliation and redemption that has followed the war. And one of the interesting things around the shifting of the Chinese narrative on World War II is how that is not pointed at UK or Australia, that's pointed at Japan, to be honest. And I think that is interesting as part of the strategic reset. So thank you for raising that historical point.
Lord Peach, in an area where grey zone coercion now blends seamlessly with the threat of long-range strikes, space disruption and AI-enabled misinformation, what do you believe is the single most underestimated vulnerability in the Australia-UK Defence Partnership? And what should we be doing in the next 2 years to close that gap?
Wow. I mean, far be it from me to talk about our vulnerabilities in public. I mean, you think he's giving up. I'm not joking. Let's not make it too hard.
Sorry, my neighbour said you weren't going to answer that question. So.
Okay. Let's not, we can... There's another quote from the Chiefs of Staff in UK and I think it was the Combined Chiefs of Staff, so, implying that you were very much part of that discussion, which you were, was this sort of sum of their fears argument at the darkest points of the war. And remember the Imperial War Museum has sites all around London, and one of the sites is the Cabinet War Rooms. And Mr. Churchill took to his bed for 4 days when the Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk. And you could argue with me, and we could argue this all night in this place, I'm sure, Matt, whether that was the lowest point, and everybody has their definition of the lowest point. So my direct answer to your question is we mustn't give in. We've created a strategic manoeuvre. Thank you. We now need to deliver the strategic manoeuvre. So we must keep going. The things that the adversaries will throw at us, we can't yet see. You touched on some really interesting ones. I think grey zone, once we get industry, I talked about insurance on purpose, because it's never talked about. And it's because it's secret. It's because, they do their thing and we do our thing. No. Actually, the maritime domain, and there's lots of very distinguished sailors here, in the maritime domain, that's already done. Ships switch their AIS off all the time. They spoof, they jam, they reconfigure their shapes at sea and all that stuff. So the grey zone is already here. We just need to work through that and call it out. Space I work in space. I declare that interest too as an advisor, and I chair a UK space company, which has some really interesting capabilities. And we need to take this very seriously. I think the nascent, latent Australian space sector has got huge growth potential. The UK in its knowledge economy has got some fantastic space companies. And we are in a potentially monopolistic situation for launch. So prices may not be always as they are today. We face the risk of strange things happening in space. A very expensive satellite has just been destroyed. It wasn't British or Australian, or Russian, or Chinese, or American, by a bolt from its sister satellite. So space junk is not just a theoretical think tank thing. It's very real risk and threat for everybody. But you add to that junk by taking the next stage. Some very interesting companies, by the way, looking how to clear up space. And I've had a presentation from one of them, which is like imagine a dustbin lorry without wheels that's like a spacecraft that opens up its dustbin and then scoops up all the rubbish in that bit of space, closes the door again, comes back to Earth. Well, that's a real proposition, because otherwise the space junk is going to make the areas where we can now easily put things in orbit harder to operate in. I always worry if people ask me a question about space, I can get into all sorts of detail. But suffice it to say, you're right on the money. And of course, those who wish us harm are also suffering from the same problem. The difference is we care and they don't. The surprising thing, which is commercially sensitive, I'll say to you, in the spirit of friendship, please protect, is you try getting insurance for a spacecraft now, because the risks are too high. AI and misinformation. Misinformation is a fascinating subject, over talked about and studied. And misinformation, disinformation is slightly different. In the Balkan region, it was so easy. Russia today operates without let or hindrance in most of those countries, with no editorial control whatsoever. Perhaps to be more topical and a little bit more controversial, one of the less publicised pieces of Mr. Putin and Mr. Modi's meeting was complete access for Russia today to the entire Indian market. So 1.5 billion people are going to see what Russia today thinks. And one or two of them might believe it. So one of the things I've learned, particularly in the region I was responsible for my government, was it's not so much how the techniques work, it's what the people who receive the information believe and what they want to believe. And getting into that is something we're going to have to do if we're going to push back. And one of the ways of pushing back, of course, is we try to do in NATO, sometimes with success, not always, was actually put our own information out at pace. And one of the problems with military bureaucracies is they don't quick enough compared to the commercial sectors and some of these new social media outlets. So it's a really complicated question. All of those things matter. And I still think we can, if we recognise the problem, we can deal with it.
Sir, Anchor Broderson, semi-retired Air Force officer. Apologies. I'm interested in your views on what the potential impact of Trump is in
There was a British comedy programme which one of two of you may have heard of called Dad's Army. And my answer is don't panic. I absolutely mean that. NATO's not dead. Sakho was replaced on time on the day he was supposed to be replaced by a very distinguished four-star officer. All the US senior appointments in NATO are filled by very distinguished and experienced people. Mark Rutte is a very effective Secretary General. My successor, Admiral Devoni, is a very serious and very successful four-star leader. So don't fall into a trap set by journalists and others that tell you that NATO's finished, NATO's dead, NATO's now going to be a European thing. Because all that will do, by the way, and I'm being very honest with my Australian friends here, don't get me into trouble back home, please, please, is let's not then just have an argument about which European nation is going to be the new Sakho, which is the risk if some of these silly stories in Brussels take hold. So don't panic. It's an important document. Actually, there's a lot of common sense in there as well as some statements. The European bubble, where I used to live, has gone a bit mad this week. It has a European Council next week, and that will occupy them until Christmas. And then I think context will come back in. At the same time, I'd like to explode a myth. Every single press conference I did as CMC was 100% attended by the Russians. Every single time. Secondly, at every single press conference I did, I got the same question, which was, could you please tell us, it was done with more or less politeness, mostly less, about the frictions, the war, the threats, the difficulties between the EU and NATO. And each time I refused to say any of those words, because none of it was true. The thing I learned, as I think many people who do learn these things, is actually the journalists wanted that story. There was no truth in the story because we cooperated. And once we stopped cooperating, started competing, we were two different animals. NATO is a military alliance of sovereign states who've moved through their parliaments to belong to it. The EU is a political organisation that does some military stuff in the margins. They don't even have anywhere to meet. The military committee in the European Union often couldn't find a meeting room. And no, we don't do irony in these talks, do we? But ironically, they would ring me up and say, could you give us a meeting room? So let's not pretend these are apples and, they're different fruits. And we were a military alliance with a 24/7 military command structure doing deterrence, and if deterrence fails, defending Europe. With secret plans. I flatly refuse the many questions I had from journalists to why I was accused of crossing our values by not publishing the NATO military strategy, which was a secret document. And in the end, I won that argument with the journalists over and over again. So we're not dead yet, is the way to answer. And actually, you'd kill an awful lot if you suddenly tried to re-engineer an architecture which isn't an architecture. They're two very different organisations. Now, there are people playing games in that mix. Of course there are, for their own advantages or their editorial advantages or whatever advantages. But frankly, let's stay calm and carry on.
Sir Desmond Woods, USI, and also Australian Naval Institute. Your fellow peer, the Lord Alan West, Sea Lord, like yourself, regularly draws attention to the problems in the production of SSNs and SSBNs. And of course, it's important to us that Barrow is capable of producing new classes of submarine, particularly the replacement for Vanguard with the dreadnoughts. That's a national priority that can't be dodged, while simultaneously designing and making available the first Astute, which will be the first of class from which we'll be building here. That's an awful lot to ask of one small-ish shipyard. I know the Americans are having similar problems with the production of SSNs. Can you give us confidence that we will see an Astute on the timescale that we want so that we can get on with replacing our submarine capability here?
I do give you confidence. I was given responsibility for the nuclear enterprise in 2013 by Prime Minister Cameron, and the first place I visited was Barrow. So I've got about 12 years under my belt of visiting Barrow. And it is different now and better now. And I was really, again, returning to the excellent Australia-British Chamber of Commerce event. I mean, we really can see the fruits now of the investments in academies and skills. And I keep going back to this because it's the skills we deliver now that will answer your question. And that some of those skills are long burn. Sometimes we could probably speed up some of the training. The Rolls-Royce Academy, because Rolls-Royce is very much part of this story. It's not just about Barrow. The Rolls-Royce Academy at Derby has got to be amongst the best of its type in the world. And I can see great opportunities for young Australians to go into these academies and into these structured learning, skill development now to get ready for those days. And I'm really serious that one of the routes to give you the confidence in my answer is to build the people-to-people links, the university-to-university links, the accreditation links, the accreditation of each other's qualifications links, and the regulators' ability to work together to regulate each other to a common standard and not create bespoke regulations. I mean, it could go on, and I have a lot of experience of that. All of that is going in the right direction. So that's the highest confidence I can give you. And I have seen some of these facilities. I talk to Rolls-Royce and BAE Systems regularly. And these are, transformed is a word that I think is overused, but they're certainly different, they're better, and they're quite big to us. They may be small to Western Australian eyes, but they're quite big to us as facilities. One of the ways they have been transformed is modular construction. And that was a read across from the Typhoon program, the Eurofighter, as some call it, Germany, was a direct read across. And it was quite clever by engineers in BAE Systems to notice that if we can do this for a fighter, why can't we do it for a ship? And we started with small patrol boats, and we moved on to frigates, then to destroyers, and then the carrier. And the carrier was the first. The Americans kept telling us we couldn't do it, but those carriers were built in the way that a modular construction, which was designed for the precision needed for the Typhoon program. And when those units, I was literally at the departure and at the arrival, because it took a long time to go by barge all the way around Scotland. And they fitted to the far less than a millimetre. And those ships are beautifully modular construction. So we can do this. We can do this.
Lord Peach.
Hi, Bill.
Good to see you again, sir. Finland and Sweden are relatively newcomers to NATO, and the Finnish leadership in particular being particularly impressive in carrying the debate for Ukraine. So I guess my question's in two parts. What has NATO gained from the joining of Sweden and Finland? And the second question relates to, could you give us some insights into the coalescing of European support in support of NATO and the challenges associated there and with supporters like Hungary?
It's quite a big question, Bill, thanks. Firstly, let's be clear. Not everything has gone Russia's way. Don't believe that it has. So a strategic loss for Russia has been Finland and Sweden in NATO. And as the former CMC, I can assure you, I absolutely know what I'm talking about, that we've now simplified our defensive problem. Immensely simplified our defensive problem. Because the border was really odd, and Atlantean air became even more complex, particularly air. All now simple. Secondly, and perhaps, you won't get this perhaps too often, for the first time in the expansion of NATO, all sovereign choices made by sovereign nations through parliaments, we've imported two allies with fully formed and grown independent military-industrial complexes. That's a big deal. We're not talking about how we re-engineer their old Soviet kit. We're talking about how we absorb their better kit. We're talking about how their military-industrial complex, which is more efficient than many in NATO, we can learn the lessons from them. We're talking about how their total defense concept, and I've been on exercise with both in incredibly realistic exercises, how we can learn from that. We're talking about all the things I mentioned on reserves, and I hope we're taking it seriously in both countries. They're already doing, Bill. And actually, it's a fantastic model. And the people have bought into it, which is perhaps more important. They're slightly different between Sweden and Finland, the way they do it, but it doesn't matter. Norwegians are very similar, Danes are similar enough, and the Baltic states are similar enough. So your answer to your question is, if you loop all that, that's quite a lot of allies, that's quite a lot of strength, and that gives quite a lot of deterrence on that northern flank. Of course there are spoilers. There's spoilers in every NATO committee. Some people are quite professional at it. But if you're the chair of it, or you've got to get a result, you get to know who they are, and there are techniques of managing that. I can honestly say, hand on heart, they didn't fail. In my time, I never had to write, I did not have to write the letter to the Secretary General saying we have failed to reach consensus. It was tough, difficult, lastminute.com, but we didn't. We always met consensus. But my word, the strategic win for the alliance is Finland and Sweden in NATO, for sure.
What lessons can we learn then to inspire our reserves and cadets here, because we are struggling, from your various experiences in other countries?
Well, first of all, and it's a great question, late in the evening particularly. No, I mean it, because firstly, we have to ask ourselves a question almost sort of every day, and I'm trying to work on this through the House of Lords as a platform, or through the committees particularly, is have we got the right narrative to encourage the nations, in this case UK and Australia in the spirit of Field Marshal Blamey, to volunteer? Have we got the right narrative for those who transfer from regular service into strategic reserves? I can tell you in the UK we have not. And we're working with the new Minister for Veterans and People in the UK on that narrative right now. So the narrative really matters. And that's not about frightening everybody. It's about reminding them, in the case of the Strategic Reserve, that's an actual legal responsibility. And we've been a bit reluctant to do that. Then it's about, for the Volunteer Reserve, making them feel they're making more than a lifestyle choice. And then it's about, for the auxiliaries, finding their specialisations. And I can think of about 8, that cyber, medics, logistics, things like that, where we might be able to work in partnership with civilian agencies and civilian organisations. And then it's about, with the cadets, I've learned this the hard way, and I was a cadet, is getting the adult volunteers. I talked about it this afternoon in Russell Building. You know, I was brought into the cadets and then took the decision to join based on the World War II generation, who gave freely of their time for no pay and no support to do that work. So it's that spirit of volunteering to give back to society. What the Swedes, going back to Bill's question, the Swedes call civics. And that's what they have no shortage. The buy-in in Sweden, which is a very liberal country, and Finland, which is slightly less liberal but very serious country, is incredible. I've never seen, and you can push to find dissenters and malcontents, and you won't find them. That's the sort of perfect answer, but we've got to start somewhere. We've got to build that narrative. And then the thing, I've talked about this before today, so I'm repeating myself, sorry, is mobilisation. It's a big word. But if you're not even prepared to think about exercising it, you're not going to be able to mobilise. So you have to do it, and then it's going to be ugly. It's going to be very ugly in the British case. And people are going to say, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it because we need to expose how difficult it is. And the Finns, I've talked to Finns a lot about this. And they have national mobilisation. The Swedes have it, and we need to get back to that. And that also, what that does, by the way, it gives the reserves a sense of purpose. And they feel, and this is a good sort of summary point really, they feel they're part of a bigger thing. They feel they've got a part in the national plan. They feel belonging. And, you know, for society, that's quite good. And cadets, this is sort of, I can feel the ice cracking under my feet here, Peter. But for cadets, I understand that there are people who think we're crossing the line towards creating child soldiers. We're not. We're giving structure to young people at a time when the world is sort of fuzzy and soft. And actually it's remarkable if you go in our inner city areas or our bigger urban areas to see these small cadet units. It's really uplifting with a handful of civilian and volunteers who we don't pay, who are proud to wear the uniform and have good training these days and safeguarding, all that stuff. And yet you can feel the energy from the young people as they're given this sense of structure. So that's why it matters. I think UK and Australia could work on regular reserves and cadets very harmoniously and learn from each other. But we need to do it now.
Thank you for the talk, my old instructor. Do we have enough time? We're hearing here that the most dire strategic circumstances since before or after the Second World War, and because you were part of saying some of those things. We're seeing talk of conscription in Germany, hospitals in France, and the UK talking about preparing and being better prepared. Do we have enough time? Do we have the community resolve, the political resolve to do the things that we need to do? Because I think Australia, in a very strange way here, we're coping without warning time. We've not been in this position before, and I don't see that momentum or that impetus. So what about from the point of view where Europe, France, Germany, UK and others are starting to prepare? Can you get ready in time, noting that hybrid war has already started, grey zone warfare is on, I think the war in space has begun, and we're certainly not ready for that. So how do we get ready?
Well, it's a combined effort, and it is exactly, I sort of loop many of the answers together, actually, and many of the questions together. The urgency point you make well. Much of this has already started. There is a reluctance to shift the narrative from the sort of announceable narrative we have in our governments. I think this is a bigger narrative, and I think it needs attention now. And that's where places like the Houses of Parliament in both our countries come in. And they need to be part of that conversation, because they need to help shape that narrative. We also need to work with the media, because it's often, as the Lenin dictum, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back with the media, then challenging, with particularly going back to reserves and cadets. We're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. We're going to recreate Dad's Army, and then they put pictures of the TV programme on all the newspapers. Everybody giggles and then says there's no threat to the UK anyway. And I'm sure it would never happen in Australia. But we have to at least explain to editors and senior media people why we're doing what we're doing. But it is the narrative which then I think I'm confident that the spirit to volunteer and help is there. And I know our Prime Minister thinks that. I don't know whether your Prime Minister thinks that, but I'm sure it's there in Australia. I'm sure it's there. It's just then unleashing that thought and then having been ready to absorb the volunteers. Because one of the other things, we've contracted out, outsourced so much stuff that you're going to have a different contract dynamic to enable a speedier process to get the reservists in, to get the regulars trained, to get the submariners skilled up, to get the engineers tooled up, to get a different relationship with industry that brings sponsored reserves into the factories. There's a lot of work to do, I'm afraid, but we can do it. It's the political will, so it starts in Canberra and it starts in London. Well, thank you. Very nice to see you.
Lord Peach, so much to absorb and appreciate tonight, and have no fear, I will not attempt to summarise the key themes for fear of diminishing the quality and power of your presentation tonight. Thank you for a highly compelling and urgent argument in support of your title for this oration. Why partnership and why now? The Australian national security and defence goals of strategic deterrence and national resilience in support of what we call national defence will be a critical challenge in our lifetime. We, all Australian citizens, need to be informed so that we can be persuaded to consider seriously our roles and contributions to national defence. You've done a great service to us this evening. In appreciation of that contribution, in this year's oration, the Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey Fund and USIACT would like to present you with this medallion in appreciation. Safe travels and wishing you all the best in your not inconsiderable dance card into the future. Please allow me a few minutes just to wrap up. Again, As I mentioned at the start, we can't do this without sponsors, and we greatly appreciate the sponsors' support, in particular Defence. Tonight, however, would not have been possible also without the focus, commitment and leadership of my Vice President, Ms Candy Howe. Candy. Normally we just focus on the one target and give it our best shot, but we've got a whole agenda with Defence over these 2 days, which was, we really do appreciate Lord Peach's effort across these 2 days, and bringing that all together is largely due to Candy's considerable powers of organisation and delivery. So thanks again, Candy. Special mention also to Tom and the rest of the committee members for all of their support to Candy and myself in bringing this night together. Please show your appreciation. And while I've got your attention, Christmas drinks on us tomorrow, 6 to 8, Dunkerin House, if you've got a free moment. Thanks very much again for attending.